Hello everyone, this is Xiaomeng from the Institute of Economic and Social Research at Jinan University. This short talk on climate change, agriculture, and migration was prepared by Dr. Shuaizhang, Feng, and me, and we would like to express our sincere appreciation to the conference organizers and all the participants here today for allowing us to make the presentation in this special format. Our plan for the talk today is to walk through the emerging literature on how climate change affects migration. And under the guidance of economic theory of migration, we will emphasize the important role of agriculture in this climate-migration relationship and point to a few directions for future research. As everyone is aware of, climate change is perhaps one of the most challenging issues of this century. These figures were drawn from the 2014 IPCC report. Those on the left show that the global climate has been changing rapidly over the past 100 years or so, including rising temperature, changing precipitation patterns, increasing numbers of extreme weather events, with implications like sea level rise. And the maps on the right show that climate change will continue to be changing over the next 100 years. If you have read the latest IPCC special report just released this fall, there's a sentence saying that global warming is likely to reach 1.5 degrees between 2030 and 2052 if it continues to increase at the current rate. In addition, even if we push forward on mitigation and lower down the emission level, the climate will still continue to change for a while, and we need to be prepared for its serious implications. These facts imply that adaptation is very important and also emergent, even if mitigation has been taken place. For economists, adaptation to environmental change has been a central question in the economics literature. Specific to climate change adaptation, among many potential options, migration has always been considered as a very important adaptation strategy. If a place is no longer suitable for someone to live because of climate change, an option for this person is simply to migrate to another place. According to a 2017 FAO report, from 2008 to 2015, there were about 27 million people migrate because of natural disasters every year. And the International Organization for Migration projects that environmental degradation related to climate change may induce 200 million people to migrate by 2050. So far, we have been talking about climate change as a general environmental phenomenon, but it actually has different aspects with different implications on migration. Here we made some summary based on a quick survey of the literature. For example, changes in precipitation and temperature are found to influence internal migration, especially rural-urban migration. This is likely resulted from induced changes in rural income tied to agricultural production. And we will talk about this channel in more details later. Some other phenomena related to climate change, like soil degradation and sea level rise, will also affect migration decisions. Note that the studies listed here include both developing and developed countries. Some effects, like the temperature effects, are found to be qualitatively similar for places like Pakistan and places like the United States, but some effects, like the effects of soil degradation, seem to be more country or region specific. And this brings a concern or puzzle in this literature, as some studies claim a significant climate-migration relationship, while other studies argue that climate change is not that important for influencing migration decisions. Also, among those support the climate-migration linkage, there is still disagreement regarding the effect of specific aspects on migration, say temperature effects or precipitation effects. More recently, a strand of literature tries to use bilateral migration data to more systematically examine the climate-migration relationship under a global context. However, the findings of these studies are still not fully aligned. How should we interpret all these disagreements or even contradictions in this literature? Or take a step back, should we think them as disagreements or just a reflection of heterogeneity? Here we show the simple graph just to help illustrate the idea. As we discussed above, climate change as a general environmental phenomenon, it has different specific aspects. Temperature change and precipitation change will lead to different implications that are related to migration decisions. This creates a first layer of heterogeneity as the specific form of climate change differs across space and time. Which channel does climate change essentially affect migration also differs in different contexts. If we consider climate factors directly affect human health or labor productivity and induce migration decision, then what type of activities the potential migrant is involved matters for his or her migration decision. If we consider climate factors affect migration through things like expected income or profitability, then which type of income source matters for the decision maker, since different activities have different levels of vulnerability to climate change. This will create a second layer of heterogeneity. In addition, the initial situation could matter for migration decisions even if climate change per se is sort of uniform. A 1-degree warming in high-latitude region will have a different implication from the region near the equator. A sharp precipitation change in countries that allow people freely move will also have a different implication from those countries with stringent residence registration and administration. These endowments issues will further complicate the effects of climate change on migration, contributing to the substantial heterogeneity in existing empirical evidence. To have a better understanding on the mechanism, it's always a good idea to look into what theory can tell us. Although how climate change affects migration is relatively a new topic, there has been a long history behind the theory on migration. The neoclassical migration theory was originally developed at the macro level. It argues that the driving force of migration is the wage differential. The macro level theory was then adapted to the micro level. It says that for individual decision making on migration is essentially a cost-benefit analysis. If the expected return of migration is higher than the opportunity cost, an individual will migrate. Then the new economics theory of migration appeared, and it challenges some of the assumptions and conclusions of the neoclassical theory. One key feature of the new theory is that decision-making unit is not really individuals, but larger units like family and households. Another key feature is that the objective for this decision-making unit is not simply profit maximization, but also risk minimization. This also has something to do with various market failures in the developing country context. For example, for places with no available crop insurance markets, a rural household may send one of its household members to cities for some type of employment, so that even if there is a crop failure, the household can live on the remittance sent by the city worker. Sending out a migrant worker in this context is essentially a self-insurance strategy for the household. However, for some very poor individuals or households, a migration motive does not necessarily translate into actual migration. The situation could happen no matter if we are under the neoclassical world with a new theory of migration. For subsistence farmers, an important complication is the existence of liquidity constraint. To make it easy to illustrate the idea, suppose we are under the neoclassical framework. We can frame an individual's migration decision as a two-stage problem. The benefit of migration is to be realized at the second stage, but the action of migration will incur a substantial cost at the first stage. If the individual is too poor, with no savings or valuable assets, even if he or she is willing to migrate, it could be simply impossible if the cost of migration cannot be covered in the first place. This type of situation is especially worrisome in the context of climate change, because those cannot afford migration are also likely to be the group of people that is most vulnerable to climate change. Because they are poor and lacking assets, they typically do not have methods to adapt to climate change locally, and they can also hardly smooth their consumption when natural disaster hit them. By revisiting the theory, we highlight that the underlying motive for migration is closely related to chasing higher profits, maintaining lower risks. The decision-making might be based on families or households, not just individuals, and the ability to migrate also relates to liquidity constraint for very poor people. It's self-evident that income or expected income is critical in shaping migration decisions. In the context of climate change, for many places, it's very likely climate change will do harm to agricultural productivity, which could incur substantial losses and risks for many people that are dependent on agriculture. The literature on how climate change affects agriculture has been very well developed. Economists have shown that climate change will decrease agricultural revenues and farmland values in many crop-producing regions. Econometricians also have estimated that climate change will decrease yields of some major crops. Because climate change itself is heterogeneous across the space, it will gradually reshape the global agricultural sector, and the evolving comparative advantage in agriculture will guide labor flows both within and across countries. If climate change is expected to seriously impact the return of staying in the same place and living on agriculture, the individual or the household may migrate if the expected return at the destination can justify the opportunity cost and if they can also afford the cost of migration. Now let's turn to looking at what empirical evidence has told us on the role of agriculture in the climate-migration relationship. One method is to use a two-stage approach, which is essentially an instrumental variable approach. Dr. Feng's work on Mexico-US cross-border migration led this group of studies. The idea is very simple. In the first stage, crop yield is regressed on weather variables so that the econometrician can obtain a predicted crop yield that captures the yield variation that's induced by the weather variation. Then in the second stage, regress migration measures on predicted yields and the obtained estimates will reflect migration response to crop yield changes that are induced by weather fluctuations. Feng, Kruger, and Oppenheimer 2010 and Feng and Oppenheimer 2012 find that the elasticity of Mexico-US cross-border migration with respect to weather-induced yield loss is about 0.2. Using the same methodology, in another study on US Corn Belt, Feng, Oppenheimer, and Schlenker show that a 1% weather-driven reduction in corn yields is associated with about 0.3 to 0.4% migration out of rural counties of the Corn Belt. Gisou, Manning, and Taylor 2017 look at how climate change affects various labor market outcomes in Mexico. In one of their regressions, they used this two-stage approach to estimate that weather-driven yield reduction is associated with a lower probability of local agricultural employment. There's a potential concern over this two-stage approach. Since weather variables serve as instruments here, the validity condition requires that weather only affects migration through the channel of crop yields. To what extent this is true might be something debatable. In empirical analysis, researchers typically rely on some unique variation or comparing different sets of regression estimates to alleviate this concern. Another method is simply to infer the role of agriculture by comparing different estimates, which does not model the channel explicitly with an instrumental variable approach. This set of studies typically set up regression models that allow for some type of response heterogeneity, in which the source of heterogeneity ties directly to agriculture. For example, Dr. Feng's work jointly with Tsai and other co-authors used bilateral migration data and estimate a panel model with country pair fixed effects. A dummy variable that indicates the origin country being agriculture dependent is interacted with temperature and precipitation variables as additive terms in the regression equation. The results show that temperature and precipitation effects are only significant for those origin countries that are agriculture dependent. Using a similar dataset, Cattaneo and Perry 2016 get some similar findings. In addition, they also find that, to the contrary of middle-income countries, in poor countries, higher temperatures reduce the probability of migration to cities and to other countries. This is very likely caused by severe liquidity constraints, as we discussed at the theory part. Missy Ryan and Schlenker 2017 study how temperature affects asylum applications to the EU. When inferring response heterogeneity, they argue that temperature effects on asylum applications is more significant for countries where a larger fraction of people is involved in agriculture. Some other studies also find precipitation deficiency increases undocumented migration from Mexico to the United States, especially from those most agricultural states. All these studies show the importance of agriculture in migration response to climate change. However, we are not satisfied with what we have learned. Migration, as an economic outcome, is a single measure of labor markets. As economists, we would like to know more on other related outcomes. One important consideration is how climate change affects local labor markets. We care about things like employment in both agricultural and non-agricultural sectors, the effects on both high-skilled and low-skilled workers. Would climate change influence them differently? And what's the mechanism? We also care about things like social unrest and conflicts. These things are closely related to migration. If a large amount of climate refugees enters into a country, what's the social implications for that country? We just list a few things to consider here, but this is by no means exhaustive. Let me wrap up. We walk through the literature that shows climate change has serious implications on migration, both within countries and across countries. We argue that the climate-driven change in agricultural productivity is a main driver in migration decisions, and this could also help explain some of the disagreements, or more properly, heterogeneity in the existing literature. This heterogeneity also highlights the importance of having more regional studies, and in the same time, looking at other economic outcomes jointly with migration measures can be very helpful to better understand what's exactly going on in the relationship between climate change and migration. Thank you.